Well, good evening, everybody. This is a story about names. When I first asked him his name, he didn't answer. He looked down for a few seconds and said quietly, "You can call me anything. The world doesn't call me by name anymore." That was under a bridge in Shenzhen. Cars were rushing above us. People were walking past. And he was just sitting there, quiet, tired. I was there to research homelessness. I thought I was prepared. I had a survey, I had a pen, and most importantly, I had a plan. But that single sentence changed the way I saw everything. Because when someone's name disappears from their life has actually quite a bit of a change, right? Their life changes in a way that we can easily overlook. But if we are here to discover what really it is about, it can be something quite dramatic. At the beginning, my goal was simple: to understand how homeless people live in the city. I wanted data, I wanted numbers, I wanted location, and most importantly, I want causes. But once I started talking to people, I realized the real story wasn't about statistics. It was about names. Many people didn't want to tell me their real names, though they tell me fake ones, and I'm not going to mention their names for privacy reasons. Others had different names in different situations. One for temporary jobs, one for shelters, one for street friends. When I'm doing this research, one man, especially one man that has locked in my memory, and I still remember him today. He laughed at me and said, "I've had many names. None of them belongs to me anymore." It sounds like a small thing, but losing name changes everything about how you live. Let's try to imagine what happened when you no longer have a name that the system recognizes. For example, you can't rent an apartment, you can't apply for work for obvious reasons, you can't register for healthcare because every time you go to hospital, you have to insert this ID card into the machine to go to see a doctor, right? And eventually, you can't even receive public aid because every form demands a name that matches an ID. So people I met under the bridges, in parks, they keep moving around, quietly, constantly, trying to avoid trouble. After a while, they stop expecting anyone to remember them. They don't look for help anymore because they assume no one will care. And that is actually the truth. When I go past this area, people are just trying to avoid them. No one tries to make any eye contact with them. They form small circles for obvious reasons because people who recognize each other in their groups by face, not by name. They live day by day without planning for the future. One man once told me, "When no one calls your name, you stop thinking much about tomorrow." Now, I didn't give much thought into that, but the later I go, I find that sentence quite philosophical, quite deep, and it has made a quite change to how I see those people. In Shenzhen, a city known for speed, for technology, for opportunity, I met people who had completely stepped outside this world. They were still there physically, but socially, they had vanished. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic at all. It was a quiet process and quite systematic. The kind of disappearance that happens when rules and systems become so efficient that they forget to see human being behind the form, behind the ID. A few months later, I went to my grandfather's village near the Yellow River. It's a small rural place, and I gotta say it's a nice place because I really enjoy the rural view over there. It has flat fields, old brick houses, and long family histories. I went there hoping to discover something different from the city, to learn more about my own roots. At first, I thought it would be completely different. it should be a place full of names, right? When you go back to your hometown, you see on the ancestral hall, there are names everywhere. I expect it to be full of stories, to be full of traditions, right? The same kind of disappearance, however, was happening there as well, just in a different form. The village had changed its name twice in the last decades because of various reasons. Families have been moved after floods or new construction projects. They live beside the Yellow River, and I don't know if any of you have growing up in an environment like that, but living beside Yellow River is a huge risk. And sometimes you have to move from place to place just to make sure that the river won't crush your crops and just turn everything else into ashes. And on the old stone tablets near the ancestral hall, the carved names were actually fading. No one could tell who most of them were anymore, and when I asked the elders about the ancestor, they often shrugged. Some said, "We don't remember them." Others said, "It doesn't matter. The young generation don't care about these names. They don't care who their grandfathers and grandmothers are, and most obviously, they don't care of people who lived 200 years back from their time, right? These are just names. The land is gone, so why care to remember them?" The loss of names wasn't just a phenomenon found in the cities. It wasn't about documents, it was about memory. It was about how people actually see themselves as part of a larger story. When these old names disappeared, like the people in the village, people started only living in the present moment. They stopped feeling connected to their past, and they stopped imagining a future that carried their story forward, like the Yellow River. Traditions that once brought families together now began to fade. Festivals that used to involve whole clans now only include a few neighbors, and that is actually quite true. The village still looked the same from the outside, but inside, the feeling of belonging had weakened. The only people I found there, most of the 98% are old people, over 70 years old, and young generations, they just go to cities to find new job opportunities. So the village are losing part of their identity because old people cannot carry their identity throughout the course of time. Their names were not being erased intentionally for obvious reasons. They were simply being left behind slowly by time and by the changes. Just like the soil there, it is eroded by the Yellow River. And by the changes that came with modernization. At first, I thought the city and the village had nothing in common. But over time, I realized both show the same truth. When names disappear, people lose connection to others and to themselves. In the city, losing your name means losing access to housing, just like we have said, to healthcare, to employment, and to recognition. You become invincible, absolutely invincible in a place that measures everything through systems and speed. In the village, on the other hand, losing your name means losing continuity. The sense that you belong to a long chain of people and stories. When that chain breaks, the future becomes smaller. And that is not only a problem of stories and history. It actually affects the young generations in the village, actually. People stop planning for the future because nothing feels stable. They live for today, not for tomorrow. That made me realize something much deeper. The loss of names doesn't happen because individuals are unlucky or careless. Oh no, I forgot to tell people my name. Oh no, I forgot what my name is. It's not that. It is shaped by the world we've actually built. A world that values order, efficiency, but often forgets to make space for memory, identity, and belonging. When we stop using someone's name, we stop recognizing as part of our shared story. And once that happens, it's easy to treat them like a number or case, or just, as we always said, someone else. Psychologists have a term for what happens when recognition disappears. They call it the minority stress theory. It is a framework first proposed by a famous scientist called Elon Meyer in the 1990s to explain why people who are socially marginalized often are under pressure, not only discrimination, but also deep, long-lasting psychological strain from it. The idea is simple yet profound. When you live in a world that constantly tells you, you don't count, you're not one of us, you're not in this society, you're not a Chinese, the stress doesn't stay outside, it seeps actually inward. Minority stress theory describes 3 layers of the experience. The first layer is external. It includes the obvious things: rejection, exclusion, bureaucratic denial. Being told no by the system, being refused by the service, being asked for papers you don't have, the ID you don't have. For the people I met under the bridges, this meant being turned away from hospitals, ignored by employers, or watched with suspicions in public places. Every rejection is small on its own, but over time, they add up, until simply existing in a city becomes an act of endurance. And now comes the second layer, and it is internal. After so many encounters being dismissed or unseen, people start anticipating it. Yeah, you're gonna look me in the eyes of suspicion, you're gonna ignore me, so let's be it. So they walk more quietly, they avoid eye contact, and they always apologize before they speak. They begin to hide parts of themselves that might invite judgment, not because they want to vanish, but vanishing even feels safer than being rejected one more time. This, Mayer found, is where the real damage happens. The shift from external exclusion to internal withdrawal. Once that happens, society no longer needs to exclude you. You begin to exclude yourself. The third layer is what researchers call chronic stress, social stress. It's the cumulative pressure of living in a world that doesn't mirror you back. You might not even notice it day to day, but your body does. Studies show that long-term invisibility raises cortisol levels, weakens immune responses, and increases the risk of anxiety, depression, and sleep disorders. In other words, being unseen changes not only how people think, but also how they physically exist in this world. When I first read about this minority stress theory, I find it mind-blowing. It felt like a psychological explanation for what I had been witnessing in real life, for those people I see under the bridges, and for those people I see in my hometown. The men and women I met in Shenzhen weren't just poor or just displaced. They were unrecognized. They lived inside a system that had no space for their names. Every unanswered form, every invalid ID, every rejection, every suspicious glance added another layer of stress to their lives. And gradually, that stress reshaped their sense of self. And that is the first layer. The same one once told me, if they don't see me, maybe I'll stop seeing myself. It sounded metaphorical, but it wasn't. People in that condition don't just lose access to housing or healthcare, they lose confidence, they lose direction, they don't know where to go in their life, they don't know what to pursue, they lack imagination. Life becomes reduced to short-term survival. What am I going to eat for breakfast, for lunch? Tomorrow feels less like a promise and more like a question mark. This is the second layer. What's striking is that this pattern doesn't belong only to the homeless or the stateless. It happens wherever recognition is withheld, to minorities, to migrants, the elderly, old people in your homes, perhaps, even those who feel unseen in their own families. Minority stress theory helps us to see that invisibility is not just an emotional wound. It is a systematic force that quietly shapes how we think, live, and relate to the world. When I think back to that man under the bridge, or the grandmother by the river, I realize they live in different worlds, yet they share something truly similar. When names disappear, people begin to live smaller lives. They guard themselves from disappointment, they stop reaching out, and slowly, the world stops reaching back. But invisibility doesn't arrive with noise. It grows with quiet, through systems, through, most importantly, forgetting, and through time. And that's why it's so dangerous, because it happens without intent, only habit. And yet, the opposite can begin with something simple. Just asking, what's your name? And be truly listening. That question can reopen a door that modern life has quietly closed. In every city, there are names we never say. In every family, there are names nearly lost to time. Remembering them won't fix everything, but it's where recognition begins. The first step back into belonging. Oops. Because to name is to remember is to care, and to care is to make someone actually visible again. Names, after all, are not just sounds. They are bridges between past and present, between one person and another. To give a name or to remember one is to say, you exist, and I see you. That's how healing begins, not with grand changes, but with the smallest act of recognition. Thank you very much for your patience.